Hello, I'm Harold Munro, editor-in-chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province, joined by City Hall columnist Dan Fumano. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Harold.
Well, last week we heard a little bit more about the FIFA World Cup coming to Vancouver in 2026. A lot of people excited about having the world's best soccer players here for several games. But there's some question as to what it's going to cost taxpayers, both provincial taxpayers and city taxpayers. What do we know about the bill?
So the bill for Vancouver to host some of the games for the World Cup was initially sort of estimated back in 2022, when Vancouver won the bid in 2022. The estimate we heard between the province and the city was supposed to be between 240 and 260 million, somewhere in that range. At the time, it was expected that the city's portion would be around half of that. And so that includes a whole bunch of things, improvements to BC Place, a lot of money for security and policing costs, public events, all kinds of stuff, administration. So now, as time went on, it seems like the city's own estimates have increased significantly for what it's going to cost, for the city's portion. So the city, as of last year, the most recent number we've seen from the city was that the city's portion would go from basically around 130 million to up to 230 million. So it's an increase of like 75% over a little more than a year, 14 months. And of course, in the last 13 months since then, inflation has, we've been in this persistent kind of inflationary environment. Inflation might have slowed down a bit, but obviously there's been significant inflation. And the other major thing is that Vancouver has gone from hosting, I believe it was, 5 games. They were expected to host 5 games initially. Now we're hosting 7. So there'll be additional costs, obviously, with hosting 2 more games. And so everyone expects that the newest cost will be higher, but we don't know how much. One of the reasons it was in the news recently was because Toronto. So Toronto's the other Canadian host city, and
Right.
they had just recently come out with a new estimate that they were expecting that their bill, they thought their hosting costs would be around 380 million, up from the previous estimate of 300 million. So we're expecting Vancouver's bill will go up, but we don't know how much yet.
Right. And that's for one fewer game, I think, in Toronto, but
yes,
roughly the same number of games. Okay. Has Vancouver given us any details? Like when you talk about the 230 million in 2023, did they break down where those costs are going to go? Because that just seems like a lot of money.
Yeah. So I've got some of the breakdown from last year's estimate. 73 million for safety and security, $40 million for venues, $20 million for a FIFA fan festival, $8 million for insurance alone, $14 million for traffic and stadium zone management. And those are just that's not the full list. There's also costs to the city involved with like admin and stuff like that. Coincidentally, just last week, the city's deadline for applications. They were seeking to hire I think the title was an administrative assistant, basically somebody who would be working full time as an administrative assistant to work with FIFA. It's like a full-time temporary job that would go from this year to basically just after the tournament ends. So that's just kind of one small example of their hiring, staff dedicated to this because it's such a major undertaking.
So, I mean, Vancouver as a city is no stranger to big events. FIFA would be one of the bigger ones, but obviously we had the Olympics here, and we'll have other events coming, and even something like Taylor Swift coming for 2 or 3 nights. So, however, I mean, they're filling BC Place Stadium. That's a lot of people coming into the city. So
the Swift effect is huge.
Yeah. So is there ever any kind of discussion or debate at City Council around the value of these events versus the cost of them?
Of course, yeah. There was in the lead up to the Vancouver 2010 Olympics. which is, one of the biggest events. I mean, I'm sure there was in the lead up to Expo 86.
Sure.
I don't recall it at the time, but I'm sure there was discussion about that. And then, of course, more recently, the Women's World Cup, part of it was hosted in Vancouver. The Invictus Games is a big one coming now, and then, we're having the Junos and the Grey Cup coming soon. But the Men's Soccer World Cup is, bigger than the Junos or the Grey Cup in terms of international visitors, I think, and just the sheer scale of the event. But yeah, so there are always these arguments about the cost benefit. Do the public benefits outweigh the costs? Of course, with the Olympics, which is, I guess, probably our biggest of these kinds of events that Vancouver's had so far, there are tangible, long-lasting benefits that the city has gotten out of hosting this event, that regular people are able to enjoy. Being able to take rapid transit to the airport via the Canada Line is something that didn't exist before. People who drive back and forth from sort of the Vancouver area to Squamish or Whistler, I'm sure, appreciate the multi-billion-dollar upgrades on the Sea to Sky Highway. There's new community centers and facilities in both Vancouver and Richmond, and maybe Whistler as well. I'm not sure. There's a whole new residential neighborhood, where in Olympic Village, where previously it was, gravel lots and some old warehouses and stuff like that. So they kind of built a thriving, vibrant new neighborhood from scratch. There isn't an elementary school there yet, where there should be, but it's kind of a separate issue. But there's a great community center and some thriving businesses, and it's a nice neighborhood where, yeah, like previously it was some pretty underutilized prime real estate. So there are all these benefits. Now, in terms of the cost benefit actual tally, does it benefit the taxpayers, or does it benefit private interests more? That's complicated, and I couldn't exactly say, but there are people doing these calculations to this day, and there's debate around it. But just as recently as during the last council term, there was discussion about Vancouver potentially hosting the 2030 Winter Olympics. So that's coming up pretty soon, but there was discussion about potentially having an Indigenous-led bid for the 2030 Winter Olympics, led by the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Lil'wat nations. And there was debate around the value of that. There were cost projections at that time, but a lot of people, including former Vancouver Sun city columnist Daphne Bramham Vancouver Sun columnist Daphne Bramham was quite, clear about her skepticism about the accuracy or of those cost projections at that time, saying they can say anything, but who knows what it's going to end up being. And there was skeptics, all over the place, saying it sounds like a nice idea to host the Olympics again, but we don't know if it's a good. And other people obviously are very excited about it. I mean, currently this Vancouver Council, seems quite excited about the idea of hosting the Soccer World Cup, and the mayor is a big soccer fan. He's a big proponent of this. He has, and he has expressed some frustration and said he would like to be more transparent about where they're at with costs, or when updated cost projections are coming, but they're limited obviously there's a lot of different parties involved. So.
Well, that's an interesting one. I can never understand the lack of transparency when it comes to people like, the IOC, the Olympic folks, or FIFA.
But
They try to keep these things under wraps. I think I've heard that in other cities, Seattle and elsewhere, they've been more transparent in terms of
that's interesting.
releasing some of the documentation. Not so much here. And of course, our province, much like the city of Toronto, sounds like it's being more transparent than the provincial government in Ontario. And similarly here, the city of Vancouver is being significantly more transparent than the province here, which won't even tell us what their estimate is right now. So I think that's what raises people's alarms, right? That raises red flags for people when governments don't want to be transparent and tell you what's going on.
Sure.
I guess the other thing is they'll quite happily trot out the $1 billion in economic benefits figure, but which they have in the case of FIFA, but we never know what, as you say, what actually goes into that $1 billion, what sort of multiplier effect they're using there, what they're attributing to it. I mean, how much tourism would you have had anyways versus how much additional tourism there is? So it's a challenge.
Yeah, and then there's downsides to that, to anything like this as well, any major event. There are obvious pluses, and our economy, tourism and hospitality is a huge part of our economy, but then there's downsides to these kinds of things as well, beyond just
And then what about from a Vancouver perspective? And this has come up with a few different things, infrastructure and others. Vancouver arguing that why are city taxpayers alone paying the bill for a lot of this? Because really, you could look at this as a regional or even more broadly a pan-regional event that's going to attract a lot of people from Surrey and Coquitlam and Burnaby and Richmond, but they're not paying for any of the costs here directly. I mean, they're paying through the province, but they're not paying municipally.
Yeah, I mean, and I would imagine, I'm not sure, but I would imagine, and I mean, the last time I was talking to people in the hotel industry and hospitality sort of industry associations about this, they were kind of anticipating that Vancouver, city of Vancouver proper itself, by 2026 won't have the hotel capacity that this is likely to sort of demand this event. So it seems quite possible that World Cup visitors, tourists coming for the World Cup, might be staying in other cities, Burnaby, Richmond, Surrey, and they could have a great visit, but that will generate economic activity in those cities, which also is great from the province's perspective. I mean, that's good. You want to generate, have this economic activity spread around. But of course, the city of Vancouver, as you say, is bearing a lot of the costs around things like security and administration and insurance and all kinds of, I mean, obviously the province is involved as well. I mean, how does it break down in terms of, Vancouver will generate the most, I would imagine, the most of that economic activity in terms of people going to restaurants, retail, shopping, tourism related stuff. A lot of it will be centered in the city of Vancouver, in and around where the games are actually happening and the viewing areas and stuff like that. But I don't know how it compares to the cost borne by the city for things like policing and all the things that the city has to take care of. Traffic.
Right. Well, good. Well, we'll watch for new numbers. I'm sure you will be watching for additional numbers coming out, along with your colleague, Katie DeRosa in Victoria. So, all right. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Harold.